Imagine you could travel back in time, to a time long before YouTube, back across 23 years. As you travel, you would see huge changes in the vegetation and climate. And now you've reached the end of a remarkable period in the Earth's history called the 90s. It is a very different world. The Himalayas still have snow on them, and the Atlantic only has a fraction of the plastic in it. This was a world where popular culture was ruled by dinosaurs. And in Walking with Dinosaurs, they showed us how these magnificent creatures lived, how they ate, fought, and reproduced, and finally how the forces of nature conspired to drive these animals to extinction. But also what came after, and finally before. That's enough nostalgia for this segment at least. But Walking with Dinosaurs wasn't alone. Its success spawned a slew of copycat documentaries all trying to do the same, and yet all falling into the same relatively tiresome pit of being forgettable in comparison. So what was it that Walking with Dinosaurs did that set it apart? And did its direct sequel, Walking with Beasts, succeed in similar fashion? How did the series begin to wane afterwards to make the same mistakes as its copycats? And are there lessons we can still take from the Walking with series over 20 years later? Let's find out. As with anything, the best place to start is the beginning. Walking with Dinosaurs was created when the BBC wanted a landmark series to take a top-to-bottom look at Mesozoic life. And in the 90s, there's no real doubt that this was at least partially influenced by the lasting plateau of paleoenthusiasm brought on by Jurassic Park. But despite this, Walking with Dinosaurs was still a big risk at the time. Mike Milne, creator of Framestore and the visual effects for the Walking with series, initially refused to do it due to the potential costs involved, only to be brought back for the fear of missing out on something exceptional. And the costs were a very big factor. Walking with Dinosaurs cost £6.1 million to make, and for years after was the most expensive documentary series per minute. 2 years later, the BBC would create the landmark series Blue Planet, which cost £10 million, although for 8 50-minute episodes instead of 6 27-minute ones. And with a 7-year production time, Blue Planet was a much safer bet. Even if it flopped, there would still be reams on reams of stock footage and B-roll to pad out the next few years of documentaries, to sell to other channels, or even to make a smaller series with. When Walking with Dinosaurs was made, it had no such luxury, and would have to stand on its own 2 feet, and stand well, because nothing like it had been made. Again, unlike other documentaries at the time, there was no guarantee this was going to work. For the Blue Planet, the Natural History Unit was riding on a high with successes of Attenborough's Life on Earth and The Trials of Life, as well as proving the general public had an appetite for a more specialised look at specific ecozones, with Life in the Freezer. Dinosaurs were popular at the time, but it's one thing to put dinosaurs in a Hollywood blockbuster production helmed by Steven Spielberg, and quite another to put them in a sober and serious nature documentary. Dinosaurs had existed as movie monsters, as dusty bone casts and as plastic toys. But this was their first outing into the public as animals in their natural environment. So when Walking with Dinosaurs was released to critical and public acclaim, it's no surprise it made some serious waves. A Peabody, 2 Emmys and 2 BAFTAs were among its awards sweep. For context, the next paleo content to win an Emmy would be Genndy Tartakovsky's Primal some 20 years later. But it's the BAFTA that really states Walking with Dinosaurs' impact. As well as rightfully winning one for Best Original Television Music, it also won one for Outstanding Innovation. It's very easy to think of the paleo documentary as commonplace nowadays. We've had so many of them scattered over the years since, and none of them would likely exist if not for Walking with Dinosaurs. It's tempting to say something like When Dinosaurs Roamed America would have just taken that niche, but it's unlikely. Not only as it may have been made in response to Walking with Dinosaurs, but between the budget, music, efforts effect, immersion, stories, and yes, at the time, accuracy, Walking with Dinosaurs really was just a perfect storm of exceptional quality at exactly the right time, to keep the momentum of dinosaurs going in popular culture. The whole subgenre was dependent on Walking with Dinosaurs being a multifaceted success. I really don't think it's an exaggeration to say that it's the second most influential piece of paleomedia after Jurassic Park itself. And for a documentary follow-up to the Hollywood blockbuster, this was vital for how we view dinosaurs. Or at least it was, until significantly worse documentaries came along to regress public opinion. But whilst Walking with Dinosaurs wasn't perfect even on its release, accuracy alone wasn't the sole factor in its success. And this won't be another video purely analysing the series for its scientific mistakes or successes, because there's a lot more to what makes a great documentary, and the pressures on documentaries that are arguably unlike those on other forms of media. Once Walking with Dinosaurs had proved its greatness with viewing figures, awards and profits, it's up to everyone else to ask what sets it apart. One of the most frequent remarks in early positive reviews of the series was how the series really felt like it had taken you back in time, how viewers really felt like they were watching dinosaurs in the wild. And one of Walking with Dinosaurs' greatest strengths is the lengths it went to for immersion. At the end of the day, this really just boils down to the amount of effort put in. Filming live-action backgrounds was adopted by a number of other documentaries afterwards. But as well as poorer visual effects, there was also considerably less attempts to integrate the dinosaurs into these environments. It really is worth watching the making of for this. Every splash, step and swayed branch had to be done manually for the dinosaurs. As well as overall effect quality, this is a big difference between it and something like When Dinosaurs Roamed America or Dinosaur Planet. Pick the majority of scenes in either of those and the dinosaurs have little interaction with their environment, rarely reflecting or splashing in water, and they often glide over dusty surfaces. It's just very obvious. Integrating the CGI with the real environment is a relatively simplistic illusion to convince the brain something is actually there. Even with the knowledge it saw on computers, repeat watchings and the advance of other digital effects, some shots still hold up very nicely. The sound design as well is also exceptional, with next to no stock sounds used. All the dinosaur vocalizations are custom mixed for the individual animals, with almost no overlap in species. Whilst often reminiscent of living animals, they don't disrupt the illusion of the Mesozoic with obvious elephant trumpets or puma screams. Similarly, the narration and lack of talking heads also do a lot here. Whilst this was considered as a traditional feature of straight-laced educational broadcasts, Walking with Dinosaurs instead relies purely on narration to treat everything as real. And the technical term for this is immediacy. Media that ignores the presence of a medium to instead present itself as an accurate window into the world. In contrast, something like Dinosaur Planet goes for hypermediacy, openly acknowledging the presence of a medium. Whilst of course this is a debate, it's not a right or wrong issue. I myself would argue for Walking With's immediacy. When Scott Sampson pops up to tell what's speculative and what's evidence, it somewhat undermines the goal of this specific format. Viewers can acquire this information for themselves in books, online or a museum. They can only really see dinosaurs reimagined as alive here. And really, why bother? It's just very bizarre to pop up and say this is all speculation, and that there are several options, and then to just pick one and go with it anyway because it's the best for the story. Slamming the brakes on the narrative to remind everyone it's all fake is just a very odd choice. And it's worth noting public reception to this isn't always good. This is anecdotal, but the laymen I've managed to ask about both programs generally regard the cutaways as an extra ad break, a time to stop watching until the action resumes, and the fact that these cutaways often intersected key narrative moments really didn't help. From what I could gather, it was only really the dedicated dino kids that were sticking around for these. It's also questionable if these are needed. Jasper James points out that people know this is a best guess, and it is somewhat patronising to assume the adult public are so naive to believe it's all real, immersion or not. And it's not like Walking with Dinosaurs didn't have its own equivalent to the Talking Heads too, instead saving all the additional information for the 50-minute making of documentary that was aired after the series. If another paleodocumentary series is ever made, perhaps in the style of the BBC format they could combine the two, and place all the cutaways in a 10-minute segment at the end that most Natural History Unit documentaries have done since Blue Planet. As overall, a drop in immersion prevents interpreting dinosaurs as real animals. When we see the complete CGI scenes in Planet Dinosaur, the first thought for many is video game. When Scott Sampson tells you about the uncertainty in various theories, and then proceeds to stick with them anyway, it just comes across as very inconsistent. It doesn't help to constantly be reminded that everything is just a big sham. But the Walking with Dinosaurs style came with risks, especially the nature of the narration standing as fact, which led to the most frequent complaint regarding Walking with Dinosaurs. Episode 3 of Walking with Dinosaurs, Cruel Sea, features the pliosaur Liopleurodon, albeit significantly larger than any recorded fossil from actual individuals. This has since become probably the most talked about and mocked aspect of Walking with Dinosaurs, often used as an official stamp to brand the series as unreliable Hollywood hokum. But whilst Walking with Dinosaurs does undeniably have its fair share of inaccuracies, it is worth exploring as to why, as well as some of the overall considerations for paleo media. The notion of Jasper James and Tim Haynes cackling together as they chink champagne glasses by a mansion fireplace, whilst the scorned and ignored paleontologist peers in through the frosty window like a Dickensian orphan, is quite unfair, as the people behind Walking with Dinosaurs consulted with numerous experts and genuinely listened to them. The Gigapleurodon came from fragmentary fossils in the Oxford clay that were believed by the advisors to possibly represent a huge predatory pliosaur around 20 metres. And it's worth noting the writers are still cautious with this. The old male in the episode is described as exceptionally large even by the standards of his species. There is no claim that 25 metres is the norm. This doesn't make the Megapleurodon any more accurate, but it does show suggestions made at the time can influence proceedings. Similarly, the huge Ornithocheirus was downsized and became Tropeognathus, with findings that only came out after the episode. Some comments I also believe show a missing of the forest for the trees. One occasional remark is that Coelophysis was not in fact a cannibal, that fossil remains in its stomach were of other reptiles, and so Walking with Dinosaurs failed at its first hurdle with an inaccurate depiction of behaviour. But really, this doesn't matter. Cannibalism is an incredibly widespread behaviour among carnivorous taxa, and is even seen in relatively gracile, unaggressive individuals such as small wildcats like lynx, or equivalent birds of prey like kestrel or hobby. There is fossil evidence for it in theropods too. And considering the nutritional stress the Coelophysis would have gone through, I'd want to see a pretty solid argument as to why they wouldn't eat each other, before claiming that this ruins the episode. It may not be based on fossil evidence for sure, but it's still a perfectly reasonable behaviour to assume. This is not to say that Walking with Dinosaurs doesn't have its significant failings. Perhaps the most frequent one not pardoned by time is the habit of placing dinosaurs in either the wrong time or place, best summed up with the Utahraptor named for its discovery in the state of Utah, indicating its existence in Utah, apparently going for a gap year to Spain. As many have noted too, some of the models for the animals are more than just a bit off. The large theropods and the Tyrannosaurus especially. A lot of the dinosaurs are also a bit on the shrink-wrapped side, especially in the face, but this is something of a byproduct of 90s paleo media, and indeed, a common theme we see throughout the flaws of Walking with Dinosaurs is that many of them come from time. It was new discoveries invalidating much of the science, and this may just be a factor that has to be accepted with paleo media. You could make the most accurate documentary ever, And in a few short weeks, a new discovery or two could completely invalidate your depictions of the prehistoric life in it. Spinosaurus is a fantastic example of this. Since about 2014, you could have made the most academically rigorous reconstruction of it, and not only would you still probably get disagreement anyway, a year later a new paper would have come out to claim otherwise. I don't think the answer is to not include such animals or stop making paleomedia, but accept that all paleomedia will likely fall victim to time at some point. And this isn't a crime so long as the creators at least made an effort for accuracy. But even if they do, it's still going to include some level of speculation. The most accurate paleo documentary of all time would be the remains of the animal talked about in purely technical terms by whoever published the most recent doctorate on it. There would be no speculation or paleo art or anything of the sort. Not even a complete cast with the gaps filled in like in museum displays. It would probably be watched by about 20 people, and all of them would probably be able to access that information for themselves pretty easily anyway. Imagine if someone made a channel like that. As a documentary, it wouldn't reach many people, and it probably wouldn't inspire much curiosity in paleontology, prehistory, or the natural world, because non-avian dinosaurs in their purest form that they still exist in today aren't that exciting for those who aren't already very invested in them. Your favourite piece of paleo art, your favourite scene of paleomedia, and probably your favourite dinosaur were helped along to that position by healthy doses of speculation, as is much of the public knowledge of dinosaurs. Walking with Dinosaurs took a lot of information, with a lot of speculation, and gave a huge amount of people a lasting interest in paleontology, prehistory, or the natural world. Far more than any dry textbook ever has, even if that's where the information came from. It turned complex theories and dusty casts into breathing animals, many of which are now sadly outdated conceptions. Learning about science can be hard. Breaking that science down to a way that others can understand it and enjoy it is perhaps a lot harder, but very worthwhile even for the mistakes that will inevitably be made along the way, and Kurzgesagt has a very good video exploring this. In past years, if making recommendations for a friend who liked dinosaurs but wasn't sure where to start, I'd recommend Walking with Dinosaurs. But as of 2022, I'm not sure that I would. After 23 years, there is now pretty much a major flaw in each episode that affects the interpretation of a key animal within it. The quadrupedal Postosuchus, the Diplodocus now likely hold their necks wrong, the Gigaplorodon exists, and the Eustreptospondylus was likely a lot larger and not an island hopper, and Plesiosaurs also likely didn't come onto land. Ornithochirus nor Tropiognathus were that big. Lielanosaura probably needed some feathers even back then. The polar allosaur wasn't an allosaur, and the Tyrannosaurus model isn't great. Whilst none of this reduces its entertainment value, the show is likely past its sell-by date for the hard information. A big problem with paleomedia is, though, that there's nothing else to really recommend. Most of the copycats for Walking with Dinosaurs just made parallel mistakes of their own, and are scarcely better, seemingly learning nothing from the trilogy of life's errors. But I think Walking with Dinosaurs still has one final gift that may last forever, and that's that it probably does a better job than any other paleomedia of depicting its dinosaurs as actual animals.
Who did I find it most difficult to work with? Animators. Definitely animators. You know, chase this dinosaur, chase that dinosaur. You'd swear we couldn't act. It's so degrading.
Perhaps 15 or so years ago, this wouldn't have been anywhere near as big a point to make, but with recent trends in paleomedia, it's definitely one worth bringing up. There really isn't any better documentary series for portraying its prehistoric life as actual living things than the Trilogy of Life. Perhaps a good place to start is its treatment of predators, and for one, they're actually seen to fail. The first Utahraptor hunt sees the Dromaeosaur bucked off. The Allosaur attempt on the young Diplodocus sees it saved by the adults, after the youngster holds the theropod at bay. Considering a lot of predators often have success rates of anything between 15 and 40%, it's important to realise how difficult a job hunting is. Predators that kill more often than they fail are a rare minority, and rarer still that they take prey larger than themselves. What's more, a lot of the time we often see the carnivores just not bother if the prey looks difficult. The Allosaurus backs down on seeing a Stegosaurus, and one of the best moments for this is the polar allosaur and the bull Muttaburrasaurus. Just the body language as both animals visibly tense up on approaching each other, before the predator's nerve is the first to break and it flees with an empty stomach. It's somewhat disappointing that this even has to be a point worth praising, considering how much paleomedia flatlined into awesome bro nature's metal garbage just a few years after. Walking with Dinosaurs doesn't reward power for its own sake in its stories. Rather, it recognises massive animals as having massive needs, and being vulnerable when these can't be met. The Postosuchus and the Liopleurodon are established as the most powerful animals in their region, yet both die agonisingly when things go wrong for them, becoming food to their own prey. On the other end of the spectrum, herbivores are powerful, intolerant, and even aggressive. The Ankylosaurus kills the mother Tyrannosaur, and the belligerent Stegosaurus drive Big Al away from the waterhole. It's nice to see some staunch resistance in a genre where herbivorous animals are typically treated as cannon fodder, especially as there are numerous findings in the fossil record of herbivorous dinosaurs putting up violent resistance to attackers. Outside of the action though, well, that's just another point. The trilogy of life has moments without action, where the animals do nothing exciting. Prehistoric life is seen sleeping, preening, just generally vibing. The mighty Tyrannosaurus is shown to rest a lot when with its young. There are so many nice shots of the old pterosaur male just not really doing much. Juvenile animals are often depicted as curious, energetic, and boisterous, and will readily tease other species in play. The series is just so packed with small behavioural moments that are so reminiscent of today's living things. Much of this is sold even further by the fact the animals look fantastic. They're adorned with complex yet believable patterns, inspired by but not duplicating real-life animals. One thing a lot of other media does is have solidly coloured brown or grey dinosaurs. When Dinosaurs Roamed America has a lot of this. Dinosaur Planet isn't quite as guilty, but the bulk of the cast are fairly monotone. Even if they're shrink-wrapped, Walking With's dinosaurs are still wonderfully coloured. Even a lot of the animals that aren't flashy can still have attractive patterns. The Tyrannosaurus has its barred tail and orange throat patch. The Ornithochirus has a lot of subtle changes in hues across its face. It's no surprise a lot of these would later become paleoart memes. The style of Walking with Dinosaurs was just a lot more attractive and natural than anything else at the time. But as enjoyable as these depictions may be, in both design and behaviour, both they and animal documentaries in general aren't immune to criticism. The most frequent one is anthropomorphization, essentially the habit of applying human behaviours to animals that don't have them. Indeed, Walking with Dinosaurs was accused of being a Mesozoic soap opera or sooty show. Modern documentaries come under similar criticism, and with the claim that focusing on individuals is overly anthropomorphic, and can lead to misinformation. So is Walking with Dinosaurs too anthropomorphized? I would personally say no, and I think one of the most frequent factors that can lead to such accusations in real or extinct animals is that a lot of people don't quite realise how complex animal lives can be, nor how dramatic. When talking about character stories in films, like a cruel ruler overthrown by their subordinates in a violent rebellion, the long-lasting bond between lovers, or the madness of Kronos eating his children, it's often believed that animals are incapable of such drama without humans cutting and stitching the stories around. But all the examples just given have occurred in the natural world. An especially aggressive dominant wolf in a pack was killed by her subordinates after constantly fighting with them. Many birds will show incredible fidelity to each other over the years. Even if they split apart for long periods, they will still find each other. And there's one astounding story of a cannibal herring gull who captured dozens of other chicks alive and fed them to the only survivor, maturing it to fledgling status despite the fact it wasn't even its own chick. The natural world has no shortage of stories on par with anything humans can write. The only difference is that animals don't have an internal monologue, and may not be as emotionally loaded in their decisions. Humans themselves are animals after all. Everything present in us has its building blocks in everything else. Animals may not have very derived emotions like guilt, for example, but even that is just a subset of stress that likely arose from Homo sapiens needing tightly knit, cohesive groups to function. To assume humans are some superior, higher form of life is arguably less scientific than the belief animals will have at least some emotional capacity. Similarly, I don't think the trilogy of life suffers from the complaints of individualism. Single animals can be considered exemplary of their species, and when you write these stories yourself, it's possible to have a single individual to follow for the ideal portrait of its kind. Some animals also just are more important than others, and can fulfill much more important roles in groups than others as per the Keystone Individual hypothesis. It can be worth looking at exceptional individuals in a population if they contribute more to their species' impact than others. And finally, with the non-avian dinosaurs safely extinct, any conservation concerns that stem from Disneyfying individuals needn't matter here. If there's one factor of Walking with Dinosaurs that's truly timeless, and unlikely to step on anyone's toes, it's the music. It's pretty safe to say that Walking with Dinosaurs has one of the best orchestral soundtracks of all time, and Benjamin Bartlett is one of the most underrated composers. Interestingly, choosing Bartlett is just another risk and perhaps one of the most surprising of the whole series. Relatively fresh to the world of work, his first project was to make a few themes for BBC radio idents, and the BBC didn't even wind up using the ones he made. With some unused ident music under his belt, Tim Haynes asked him to pitch some music for their experimental £6 million documentary, and the rest is history. Whilst everyone already knows that Time of Titans is the sweeping, grandiose epic, and indeed, with its return in the final scene of Walking with Monsters, it could almost be considered the unofficial theme for the Trilogy of Life. But I think Bartlett's skill as a composer is better showcased by the smaller pieces. One of the first drafted originally for the 6-minute pilot was Islands of Green. This was later redone for the scenes talking about insects and pollination in the pockets of vegetation, shown in Death of a Dynasty's Cretaceous lava fields. The fact that such a stunning piece that gradually swells as it uses more and more of the orchestra was made and devoted purely to the plant life and insects, in my opinion shows a dedication to telling the story of the Mesozoic, and not just solely celebrating the grandeur of the giant dinosaurs. Indeed, some of the dinosaurs themselves are overshadowed in the score by events larger than themselves. Despite the piece being called Tyrannosaurus on the soundtrack, the Rex itself is eclipsed by the events of the episode, and so the greatest terrestrial predator is only a musical footnote in a piece that slowly forebodes the KT extinction. Drawn-out high-pitched notes are almost mournful howls. The strings build tension for the dinosaurs' final days on Earth. This is not Tyrannosaurus's theme, just as it will soon no longer be Tyrannosaurus's world. Not everyone is swept aside though, and one particular individual that gets a stirring theme is the old male Ornithochirus. The 3-note theme is initially introduced in its slow and mournful form in Giant of the Skies. Used in the episode's bleak opening. It later returns booming, triumphant, and almost intimidating. But it's still as the giant pterosaur soars over herds of dinosaurs to show us the newcomers of the Cretaceous. Finally, it returns again in a single violin as the King of the Skies loses his majesty.
Heat stress and lack of food.
And begins to succumb to heat stroke and exhaustion. Bartlett also states he tried to create different sound worlds for each episode, with their own themes and motifs. This method shines especially well in Cruel Sea and Spirits of the Ice Forest. The former starts as a swaying, melancholy waltz. It's calm, but not necessarily comforting or inviting. After all, the episode opens by showing us exactly what lurks beneath the waves. As the track and episode progresses, the theme gets gradually weirder and more abstract as the episode moves to the sea at night. Ophthalmosaurus hunt in a pitch-black environment alien to us, and ancient invertebrates come to spawn from the depths. The very distorted music reminds us just how unfamiliar we are with the depths of the sea, regardless of geological epoch. Spirits of the Ice Forest starts low and melancholic, the music in a hibernation of its own, until the first light of spring wakes the rest of the orchestra for a sweeping melody, a theme used again in Antarctic spring, as the Koolasuchus is accompanied by the plucked strings often used in horror films, before the track brightens up considerably. Departure of the Muttabursaurus is all impressive melancholy as the episode reverses from summer back into winter, in one of the most stirring pieces in the whole soundtrack. You could probably break down each phenomenal piece of music, but here I wanted to focus on a few that maybe aren't everyone's instant favourites, unlike Time of Titans and Torosaurus Lock Horns, as well as talking about their role in the episode and how music was used in the series.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Except there was just one thing. Yes, one more thing. Sorry, it looked lovely, but the ticks weren't ready. So if you could just go back to the beginning, we'll have you coming in a bit faster.
Walking with Dinosaurs featured some 37 named species from the Mesozoic across its 6 episodes and 1 special, showcasing some familiar classics, but also bringing several new names to the cast. Deciding who to feature and who not to can be a tough choice for producers, considering the diversity of prehistoric life and the fact some have already had their time in the limelight. Tyrannosaurus is perhaps the most well-known dinosaur of all time. So did it deserve its episode? And with Jon Favreau's upcoming Prehistoric Planet focusing on Hell Creek, should it continue to hog top billing in paleo dramas? I would actually argue yes, to an extent. As our understanding of these animals grows, it's absolutely worthwhile reusing old favourites as our knowledge of them increases. A lot of these dinosaurs got to this level of public recognition as they're also very well known paleontologically with a lot of good specimens. If paleomedia is striving for accuracy, then species like Tyrannosaurus will be a natural choice, as we know far more about them than a lot of other giant theropods, even if there will almost certainly be significant ecological and behavioural differences between them and other megatheropods. For the purposes of documentary, they can still serve as something of a model organism, as it were. Similarly, many also note that the Tyrannosaurus model in Walking with Dinosaurs is incorrect, and despite a fair portrait, compared to what we now know about Tyrannosaurus life history, it's a relatively bland and shallow portrayal. Considering Walking with Dinosaurs' success, future documentaries should be striving to set the record straight by updating depictions of old favourites. This in turn allows documentaries to become paleontological benchmarks. The Crystal Palace dinosaurs are about on par with Fallen Kingdom, for some of the most inaccurate reconstructions ever. But they're still widely beloved to many paleontologists. Inaccurate old depictions tell us how far we've come, and what the climate of paleontological understanding was like at the time. They're far from useless even when they become inaccurate. But that doesn't mean new blood shouldn't be featured, and Walking with Dinosaurs should be applauded for how many species it brought to the forefront of public knowledge, at least at the time. Even if through controversy and resultant memes, Liopleurodon was something of a household name, and Utahraptor has since been recognised as the staple Megaraptor for anything that needed dromaeosaurs with considerably more meat on their bones. Coelophysis has since become something of a poster boy for early Triassic dinosaurs, and Ornithocheirus became a favourite pterosaur for many, with Giant of the Skies regarded as many viewers' favourite episode. Animals like Lielanosaura and Torosaurus were actually recognised as household names, and had collectible toys made of them. Unknown dinosaurs can sometimes be a challenge, but public lack of notoriety also doesn't necessarily mean dearth of information either. There are plenty of multi-specimen species with good amounts of life history and suggestive fossil evidence that, should a new Walking with Dinosaurs be made, there's a lot of strong candidates for focal dinosaurs. I think there's something that can really limit a dinosaur's potential for such reconstructions though, and that's the supporting cast. One aspect even relatively complete specimens of attractive candidates can have tripping them up is that they're the only good dinosaur specimen from their formation. Carnotaurus serves as a good example of this. A cool dinosaur, but one with numerous inaccurate depictions, making it a prime choice for a more faithful reconstruction to showcase its likely very interesting physiology through suggested behaviour. The only problem is, the rest of the dinosaurs in the La Colonia formation are fragmentary remains of unknown species. Paleomedia like this format is perhaps most limited by needing a relatively rich bone bed for a properly working episode. Both Chased by Dinosaurs and to an extent Walking with Beasts ducked around this by occasionally describing animals by just a family name. But this hardly cuts the mustard, considering it's not that educative if you don't actually know to whom the episode refers to. Rounding to the nearest 10 with poor specimens can also occasionally lead to mistakes like the North American iguanodon, or arguably the Gigaplorodon too. All in all, it seems a solid mix of old and new would be a good choice for any paleo documentary. Fresh, interesting species unknown to the general public to broaden general knowledge on dinosaurs, as well as bringing new species into other walks of popular culture, whereas new takes on well-known specimens in turn allows older paleo media to act as paleontological benchmarks, as well as updating how they're viewed in the public eye. Indeed, Walking with Dinosaurs had one final special, in which it revisited a previously seen species to perhaps become its finest hour.
He was a ferocious hunter,
Al is frequently wounded.
born into a world of hard knocks.
He has a torn arm, ripped claw, and smashed ribs.
A young romantic,
She is not interested.
he lived to kill or be killed.
These youngsters only have a few weeks of protection before the mothers view them as fast food.
From his first breath to his last, life for Big Al was an enormous adventure. This is his story, a Walking with Dinosaurs special, Christmas Day 4:35, BBC One.
On Christmas 2001, Walking with Dinosaurs would return for a one-off special, The Ballad of Big Al, an extra episode chronicling the life and eventual death of a subadult Allosaurus jamazzini specimen known as MOR 693, but perhaps better known by its more popular stage name of Big Al. And this extra episode may well be considered the best of the series. Walking with Dinosaurs typically uses focal dinosaurs, either a single individual or group to be the main character to view both the life of that dinosaur and the other animals of that geological period. Ballad takes this an extra step, and actually has a named specimen as its focal animal. With such a complete specimen, dozens of paleopathologies, and the knowledge of its early death before full maturity, a story is already in the making. Whilst we'll never know the exact way Big Al achieved each of its wounds, it allows for the course of the episode to be charted through the evidence written in stone. Ballad isn't just about Allosaurus, it's about an individual Allosaurus, and everything we see happen to it has a reasonable justification as we know it acquired these injuries. Specimens like Big Al allow for the recreation of animal lives that, while speculative, are far deeper rooted in evidence than other paleomedia. Ballad of Big Al hasn't completely escaped the brush of time though, and much like Time of Titans, newer evidence suggests that Diplodocus and Apatosaurus are holding their heads and necks wrong. The Allosaurus faces are perhaps a little on the lean side too, but it does mend some of the faults of Time of Titans. Jurassic Morrison is shown as a semi-arid fern scrubland with gallery forests, and very punishing dry seasons, far closer to how it actually was than the Mesozoic Garden of Eden. In terms of its story too, Ballad is very well crafted to continuously show Big Al as an animal, but a number of tricks are used so that the average viewer never loses sympathy for a carnivorous dinosaur. Other than small things the audience likely won't find especially endearing, Big Al is never shown to make a major kill. The episode doesn't shy away from the fact that Big Al is a predator. We're shown him covered in blood and told he's capable of making them. And he also participates in a diplodocus hunt. But he's kept as somewhat permanently adolescent in the eyes of the viewer, forever lacking this key test predators must pass to make it on their own. Similarly, Big Al is kept naive. His first attempt at mating gets him mauled. Again, Big Al fails another key rite of passage in the eyes of the viewer. The episode is constructed to keep him as a bumbling teenager effectively, before he does indeed stay forever young. Working in tandem with the writing is the music, and Benjamin Bartlett's score once again delivers. As well as using some music from Time of Titans to settle people back both into the Jurassic and the Walking With series, Ballad contains some of Bartlett's best work from the Dinosaurs episodes. The fossil is used to bookend the story, building reverence in its opening and sadness in its reprise when Big Al's corpse is found. Young Allosaurus is the theropod equivalent of March of the Sauropodlets, a light playful theme for baby animals. And finally, Battle of the Salt Pans is probably considered Bartlett's magnum opus by many, quite simply a sprawling multi-layered epic for one of the best scenes in the series, and perhaps paleomedia, that takes up almost a third of the episode. When all baked together, the Ballad of Big Al is exactly what the name would suggest. An epic tale of the brief, brutal life of a carnivorous dinosaur. An episode that transcends speculation to focus instead on a known individual, creating the strongest episode of an already great series. I imagine it's very clear by now that I loved and still love Walking with Dinosaurs. Between it and Beasts, it's probably the most influential media I've ever consumed. As said, I think its age limits it for direct species education, but it still has a lot we can glean from it for paleomedia as a medium. One thing I felt in writing this was that I was never really that annoyed with Walking with Dinosaurs for its mistakes in accuracy, as it was the first of its kind, an excuse everything following it didn't really have. A conclusion I made making this retrospective is that it's not so much that Walking with Dinosaurs got things wrong, but that everyone else after it seemingly refused to learn from its mistakes. Walking With made its own mistakes that aren't necessarily forgivable, but are understandable considering there was a lot of uncertainty on a lot of aspects, as well as it being a massive undertaking and the first of its kind. Everyone else after it had it as a benchmark and yet completely ignored it, only trying to capture the success. Walking with Dinosaurs was the first wildebeest in the river, but everyone else seemingly swam into the crocodiles on purpose. One thing I also want to add is how much I like the handling of the extinction too. Portraying this event has become something of a paleoart meme itself, and I think the mournful aspects of Walking with Dinosaurs as they reuse Giant of the Skies really sells the misery and tragedy of the end of the non-avian dinosaurs. But at the same time, the ending doesn't ruminate on it. It tells us to enjoy the animals we do share our world with, and finally that the dinosaurs as a whole did survive in birds. The episode ends with a shot of snow geese taking off, finishing on the dinosaurs of the modern day. We are still, and always have been, walking with dinosaurs. If I'm a little harsh on Dinosaur Planet or Planet Dinosaur or whatever else, know that I don't necessarily hate them. I think all of them are comparatively constrained by their far lesser budgets, and if they'd had more money, they'd have been able to considerably close the gap between them and the Walking With series. Dinosaur Planet especially, with a little more money and time, could have been something really great. It will always be limited by over-anthropomorphizing in Little Das's episode, and the truly revolting cringe narration throughout the whole series. I know some people may enjoy it, but I find it's infantilizing garbage that contributes to the image problem of dinosaurs being for children. Because as well, paleomedia is a unique format. Accuracy isn't the be-all and end-all, much as some may be clutching their fossil pearls at such a treasonous statement. Accuracy is worth nothing if the people can't understand it or they're not paying attention to it. And this is why everything has to excel in a documentary. The music, the effects, the immersion, all of it are vital to carrying across the core messages of the prehistoric life to the largest amount of people. Everything else outside the accuracy has to succeed for it to be successful enough to reach a big enough audience to educate. And so all the additional aspects outside of just accuracy are very worth discussing in regards to paleontological outreach as a whole. This is why Walking with Dinosaurs is remembered over 20 years later. The fact it excelled at so many things as a documentary and entertainment. After the Ballad of Big Al though, the Walking With series didn't stop. Following the meteorite impact, there is a series about what happened next.
And if you're a digital viewer, you can revisit last week's episode of Walking with Beasts by going to the text service from BBC at any time. This is BBC One.
Riding on the incredible success of Walking with Dinosaurs, some form of sequel was only inevitable, and the next logical step was always going to be the incredible mammals that followed in the Cenozoic. But it's worth noting this isn't the only step Walking with Beasts made. As a series, Beasts uses dinosaurs as a jumping off point to take everything dinosaurs did to the next level as a documentary. It has more intricate stories, often with much tighter focuses on the focal animal. Some of these animals are named or nicknamed. There's Half-Tooth the Smilodon, and the assorted members of the Australopithecus troupe that I also assume were a reference to the named chimpanzees of Jane Goodall's early field studies. It's arguably more violent than dinosaurs too. There's generally more blood, fighting and kills per episode, and the sense of grandeur is replaced with a gritty harshness that permeates almost every episode. The camera work too in Beasts is much more ambitious. Whilst Walking with Dinosaurs occasionally had wonderful low-angle shots, beautifully showcasing dinosaurs in their environments, outside of these the angles were relatively normal. Compare that to even just the opening sequence of Beasts, and it's clear it was already a far more dynamic series. In between the two documentaries, a Hollywood film known as The Matrix had also been released. As well as numerous well-deserved awards, this also led to a slew of slow-motion parodies in the early 2000s. And this was all because The Matrix was the film that pioneered such camera work. It's interesting how this influence was so far-reaching, even Tim Haynes decided to include it in his straight-face blue-chip nature documentary, with several scenes including either slow motion or full bullet time effects. And that is if the camera can even find the beasts. As well as its stories and camera work, Walking with Beasts also puts more effort into actually convincing the viewer they're watching a nature documentary. In Walking with Dinosaurs, the camera is granted omnipotence. It can follow the dinosaurs at will at any time or place for the viewer. Whereas in Walking with Beasts, the narration claims that animals will go missing and can't be found. The Paracitherium calf in Land of Giants and Half-Tooth in Sabertooth. Animals interact with and also occasionally even break the camera. The beasts themselves also represented a far greater challenge. Scales is one thing, but fur and fat are quite another. Despite this, the CGI is as good in Beasts as it was in Dinosaurs, with some shots aging poorly and others still looking like real animals today, with judicious use of angle and lighting. The prosthetics too required a notable upgrade. Whereas the stiff faces of dinosaurs only had 4 motor controls for the eyes, nostrils, mouth and neck, the mammals would require 25. With eyes, nostrils, lips and tongues to control, the muscular faces of the mammals required a lot of work. The music too was more experimental. Benjamin Bartlett once again makes a wonderful use of orchestra, but the sweeping themes of grandeur commonplace for both dinosaurs and nature documentaries are replaced with aggressive tribal themes. Chants and drums and even swords are brought into play here. Overall, Walking with Beasts took everything Walking with Dinosaurs did, but expanded upon it, building up from the foundations dinosaurs set. But this only goes so far. If the cast aren't up to scratch, no amount of skillful editing and top-class effects can make them on par with the great reptiles. So how were the beasts? Just as mammals had their own array of difficulties in adapting them to both CGI and practical effects, There were also a number of benefits with their interpretation in a paleodocumentary. Whilst we still have non-avian dinosaurs, there is only so much they can tell us about their huge relatives. It's limited in how much we can learn about a sauropod from a finch or a penguin, but we can almost certainly learn a lot about a woolly mammoth from modern elephant species. And even with considerably older species, today's animals can still provide much more relevant information. On this note, it's also interesting to see how certain physical or ecological properties of animals often lead to comparisons with modern animals instead of genetic ones. A good example of this is the bull-intricathere fight, which is seemingly heavily based on the necking behaviour of giraffes. Not an unreasonable assumption, as they're both large, long-necked mammalian herbivores that may share similar behaviours, but it is of course speculative, and there's nothing in the closest relatives of intricatheres, the rhinos, to suggest they may have behaved like this. I don't think it's necessarily wrong, but it's worth noting how with the Cenozoic mammals, speculative behaviours can stem from the closest analogue over the closest relative. But as well as living animals, the fossil record also has generous amounts of information for the Walking With team to inject into their episodes for some of the best sequences. Basilosaurus hunting Dorodon calves is very heavily suggested from fossil remains. Intraspecific combat is also believed to have occurred in entelodonts, with the males violently sparring with each other with face bites and holds, just as they did in Land of Giants. Smilodon are depicted as social animals, which may have been a bit controversial at the time, but was still reasonably supported, and arguably even more so today with findings of Smilodons surviving with hip dysplasia, young Smilodon only getting fully erupted canines at around 3 years, and fossils of mothers found with large subadult young. Even if not in full lion-like prides, it's still a reasonable depiction. This is not to say that Beasts hits a perfect home run, and like Dinosaurs it has a few casualties of time, most chiefly in New Dawn. Evidence suggests that Ambulocetus may not have been terrestrial, and Gastornis has since been reclassified as a giant herbivore. Some designs have aged poorly too. Despite perhaps being the face of the series, the depiction of entelodonts is very shrink-wrapped, and they would have had likely flabbier, more hippo-like faces in reality. Andrewsarchus is also more akin to a hippo wolf than a giant hoofed hyena-like animal as seen in Whale Killer. Similarly, Beasts makes a few mistakes in placing animals in the wrong area. Whilst the timing of the various animals is a lot sharper this time around, there are still a few notable mammals on gap year in places their fossils have never been found. But it is interesting that Beasts seem to have learned something from dinosaurs, and is a lot more cautious with species names too. The entelodonts aren't called Daedon or Dinohyus or Archaeotherium, they're just kept as entelodonts. Similarly, bear dogs never even get called amphicyonids. Seemingly keen to avoid another Utahraptor incident, fragmentary remains are left ambiguous as to the species, with the animal instead just getting a generic family name. Benjamin Bartlett would return to weave his magic on Walking with Beasts as well, but was faced with a major challenge: how to follow up on the award-winning soundtrack of Dinosaurs. The answer was the motif running through this part of the video, by doubling down on what made the original great. In Beasts, Bartlett doesn't just create individual sound worlds for the episodes, but an overall theme for the soundtrack as a whole, basing it, as he said, in mud, blood and desperation. And indeed, the 6-note theme from the opening titles is occasionally repurposed in various episodes to spin a thread linking them through the greater series.
The long dry season.
The music of Beasts is chaotic. There's a lot of unfinished and interrupting elements. Hog's Blood constantly has a new level of orchestra unpredictably butting in every 5 seconds to keep building the pace up, like a savage mirror to Islands of Green. There's much less focus on grandeur here too. The beasts are often considerably smaller than the dinosaurs, and other than the Land of Giants theme, Bartlett doesn't really attempt to recapture this. Even then, it's much slower and less complex, the music solemnly marching in place with the steps of the intricathere. The range of the soundtrack is also greater in Beasts too. Infanticide, for example, is a slow, morose, drawn-out piece that feels like it belongs in a slasher film, as the episode reveals that Half-Tooth's last chance of reconciliation from his pride lies bloody and beheaded in the damp grass. Sabretooth also provides a great example of the extra creativity Bartlett was throwing in at this point, with clashing swords being used in both Blood Brothers and Saber Hunters. Motifs for individual animals are also used to great effect here, perhaps most spectacularly for the mother Basilosaurus. Her theme is also occasionally weaved into the sound world for the episode overall, but it constantly follows her after she's used as the introduction for her species, as well as finally getting remodeled at the end when she successfully has her calf. With the appearances of our own ancestors and relatives in the series too, a choir is introduced in Walking with Beasts as well. The final music in the series is the tribal chanting also used in the Megalosaurus hunt, as the narrator gravely tells us of the fatalism of extinction, accompanied by a satellite in orbit over the Earth showing how far humanity has come. Similar music is also used in the mammoth hunt in the same episode, and it's unknown if Bartlett intentionally left the choir out of Walking with Dinosaurs, but it has a striking effect that every time hominids show up, they're accompanied by human voices, fierce chants for the Neanderthals, and a softer, more typical choir for the Australopithecus. As a brief aside too, an interview with Bartlett also shows why much of the amazing Walking with Beasts soundtrack never made it onto an official score. When creating the albums, the BBC didn't ask for the whole set to be compiled into one track list. They just flung them some extra recording time and told them to fit on what they could so it could be sold later. It really is such a shame, so many of the fantastic pieces can't be enjoyed outside of the episode. Music from Next of Kin, Sabretooth, and above all else, Mammoth Journey especially. Unreleased score is doing God's work in trying to get the clearest copies, but unless someone with more clout than I crowdfunds Bartlett and an orchestra, it doesn't look like we'll get them anytime soon. When the first episode of Walking with Beasts was released, an early review claimed they should have just stuck to dinosaurs, being unimpressed with an episode of small mammals. And indeed, some have suggested the reason for Walking with Beasts not doing as well in UK figures, and not being remembered the same as dinosaurs, is that mammals just aren't as interesting as dinosaurs, especially when they're often nowhere near as large. Whereas most of the cast of dinosaurs starts at elephant size and only goes up, Beasts rarely escapes beyond horse size, if that. But small stuff is worth showing, perhaps more so than dinosaurs. Walking with Beasts looks into evolutionary history, and this is a natural progression with mammals, or indeed Cenozoic animals in general, as it's the time period we're still living in. Everything that occurred has led us to this moment, to where our species is now, whereas it was only the non-avian dinosaurs' removal that likely facilitated this. It's very worth showing that Propaleotherium, now believed by some to be Eurohippus, as horses are one of the animals our species interacts with the most, and are typically viewed as powerful and majestic animals. In contrast, the Indracotheres show that animals we typically regard as prehistoric megaherbivores, rhinos, had distant ancestors far greater than themselves. The death of the Ambulocetus is quickly followed by the reassurance of the success of cetaceans, and the excellent episode Whale Killer. Primates are well covered in this regard too. In Walking with Beasts, we see ourselves go from basal monkeys in Apidium and Gardenosia to some of the first possible ape-like hominids in Australopithecus, and finally to Homo sapiens and Neanderthals in the Ice Age. Starting small in general is how life starts. And as how the reign of mammals began, it's thematically fitting that New Dawn has a cast of smaller animals. Cycles in evolution occur this way, and it would be both erroneous and somewhat tonally inconsistent to leap straight into Brontotheres and Andrewsarchus straight after the extinction. On a level away from accuracy, I also speculate there's perhaps been a tonal shift in documentaries and their audiences, outside of just showing nature at its largest and most powerful. Since the BBC began its series like Planet Earth, where there are segments devoted to the small, plain or weird, that are still enjoyed by many and do a good job of showing off lesser known species. One of the most watched moments in a recent BBC Blue Chip was of mating bullfrogs, and whilst they're among the largest in neurons, they're still pretty far from a tiger or an elephant. While some people only have eyes for the big, hairy and scary, this has never been the case for everyone, or even the majority, and leaps in filming technology now better allow for overlooked or smaller animals to get the spotlight. With its animals being made in CGI and prosthetics, Walking with Beasts never had the same issues, and could readily film Lectictidium with ease. The lives of smaller animals are no less fraught with drama or excitement, and the hyenodon hunting the Calicothea and the ensuing struggle over the kill was every bit as cinematic as the Utahraptor hunting Iguanodon. Outside of just the merits of evolutionary storytelling, the notion that the cast of beasts was boring is as outdated as the carnivorous Gastornis as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, cut! Thanks very much everyone, that's a wrap.
This is something of a meta-tangent, but I personally think that the Cenozoic occupies a bit of a weird space in popular culture, and it once again stems from the fact that it's the different but same. No matter how hard we try to recreate their appearances as accurately as possible, and how much effort is put into deliberately recreating the Mesozoic in documentary format to trick the viewer into thinking it's real, non-avian dinosaurs are alien to us. Many may not have modern-day analogues in many aspects of their physiology or behaviour, and whilst this may be true to an extent for some extinct animals, in a lot of cases we still know the family they're part of, and many still exist today. They're not gone, just different. And this is true for dinosaurs as a whole, but avians are vastly more different in appearance to a sauropod or a ceratopsian than a modern wolf is to possibly any extinct mammalian carnivore. Again, this allows for more direct references to modern animal behaviours to continue with the point that beasts embellished a lot of what dinosaurs set up. Dinosaurs gave its animals realistic behaviours reasonable for a lot of the species, whereas beasts directly takes from the modern day and applies straight to the prehistoric. Even in terms of its effects, not everything in beasts is CGI. From the first episode, there's plenty of shots of actual animals across the series too. There's no better way to convince people of the fantasy than to include a little reality. Earlier, I argued for the repeat appearances of popular species due to their ability to serve as paleontological benchmarks, and in Walking with Beasts, I believe this blessed them with a great freedom. Outside of mammoths and machaerodonts, there was no box that really needed to be ticked to update public perceptions. The Cenozoic was and still remains something of a wild west for the general public. Whilst there's no shortage of old and new media that borrows from it, like the Flintstones, Ice Age or Far Cry, it's not often that this is serious or factual content. There is no Mammal Planet, Planet Mammal or Miocene Fight Club. Thank God. And I certainly don't think Beasts squandered this freedom. In the Sabertooth episode it had them in South America, whereas they're more widely known as North American species thanks to tourist attractions like the La Brea tar pits, or their general association with other northern latitude Ice Age fauna. It placed a familiar animal in a less familiar ecosystem, to bring in some new faces like Macrauchenia. Everyone knows about the concept of the ape men and the rough idea of how humans evolved, but Walking with Beasts fully contextualizes this by putting the ape man in its natural habitat. They're no longer abstract ideas, but we get a small vision of our evolution happening in the bigger picture of our environment. The mammoth episode may really not have much out of the ordinary, and it still portrayed a different side to the Ice Age than just ice and snow. It shows woolly mammoths and other Pleistocene staples in the open, sunlit, grassy plains of Beringia alongside bison and saiga. This is a view we typically don't get. Again, I did warn you this chapter was something of a meta-tangent, but I did want to raise some thoughts on the Cenozoic and media in general. Overall, I think that Beasts fully embrace the peculiar space the Cenozoic occupies to do what this series did best: show us new species in detailed portraits, and new looks at well-known species, either in different habitats or settings to which we normally view them. So at the end of the day, where does Walking with Beasts stand with its predecessor, and what came after it? This will all just be my opinion, like this whole video really, but I believe that Beasts has aged the best of the trilogy of life, and considerably better than Dinosaurs. Whereas I was forced to concede that Walking with Dinosaurs is considerably past its sell-by date, in terms of its use for species-level education, I don't believe the same is true for Beasts. It's flawed in some aspects and dated in others, but its considerably more direct use of fossil evidence to recreate behavioural scenes really shines through. Even if they didn't have a specimen as good as Big Al to base an episode around, some of the aspects that make that episode so good are still applied to Beasts. It's undeniable the team learned some good lessons from Dinosaurs, and were far more conservative with Beasts. No speculative Lioplorodons or other such mishaps occur here, and everything is reasonably close to how it was believed to appear at the time. Despite new discoveries occurring, most of Beasts has stayed relatively accurate. Whilst this isn't something you can exactly blame Dinosaurs for, as they did their best for the time, speculation is always a risk, and some of it was very poorly founded that Dinosaurs ultimately paid for. As said in the opening chapter as well, Beasts is overall a much tighter cinematic documentary experience as well. Better camera work, soundtrack, and perhaps even storytelling all just result in it being my favourite of the three. It's tempting to ask why Dinosaurs is the big favourite for many then, but this isn't necessarily true. Dinosaurs outperformed Beasts in the UK viewing figures for sure, but that was also 21 years ago. And Beasts was also said by Tim Haynes to have actually outperformed Dinosaurs in countries outside of the UK as well. In terms of the legacy the two have left behind and how much the two is still talked about, I would claim that Beasts remains just as strong as Dinosaurs. It has a shared fanbase undeniably, but Beasts' specific interest is every bit as persistent, and I've seen a lot of polls that find the two neck and neck or one with a very minor advantage over the other. Whatever the initial UK viewing figures were, Beasts has clawed them back quickly over time, to remain every bit as relevant. To sum up my thoughts on Beasts, much like Dinosaurs, I imagine it's quite clear I loved and still love it. I think the Walking With series was so influential on me as a child, was because it wasn't just a look at prehistoric life, but so saturated with animal behaviour as well. And no matter what eon you're in, that's still relevant and interesting. The BBC also went hard with the marketing and supplementary materials as well. There were cutout cards in various cereal brands, assorted sticker and information books, a board game I remember owning but has since been lost to time, and that was just the physical stuff. Online it only got better. Once again keen to make up for past mistakes, the website had live streams before they were the done thing to do on YouTube, with the scientific advisors where you could submit questions about the episode. As well as the Beast fact files and making of, there was a lot of games geared to help educate kids about fossilization, predation, behaviour, locomotion, and more. There was even something of a sequel to the Big Al game, called Evolution, where you played as a little primate and it was really hard. I kept dying in the Eocene as apparently leaves aren't nutritious enough. In short, it was a wonderful time to be a nerdy kid, and on a nostalgic level I really miss all the interactive information and games the BBC made to supplement their natural history documentaries at the time. The Walking With series has never really been replicated or repeated, despite the fact I certainly believe it's the best format of paleo media. As the opening chapter revealed, it really was a mix of various factors coinciding that led to this particular TV phenomenon, and it doesn't really seem likely that they'll be repeated, even with the budgets the BBC are now willing to throw at their documentaries. There have been assorted documentaries since, some even looking really nice, but they never really had the same touch. David Armsby's excellent Dinosauria, despite being a wildly different formula, does tick some of the boxes that almost come close to making it feel like a spiritual sequel to Dinosaurs. A modern-day documentary, Dynasties, almost feels like a spiritual sequel to Walking With Beasts in a way too. After years of hyper-glossy Planet Earth-style documentaries, with tasteful fades to black making ecosystems feel like high-definition, deathless wonderlands, Dynasty's far more graphic approach, as well as the following of focal animals again, really brought the same vibes of mud, blood and desperation. with Benji Merison's score being a reasonable follow-up to Bartlett too. At the same time, I'm not sure I'd want a BBC-helmed Walking With right now. My thoughts on modern nature documentaries are a story for another time, if ever, but I dislike the franchiseification they've sort of gone through, with series getting sequels, increasingly big-name composers doing the soundtrack, the social media trends that accompany it. I think if Walking With was revitalised, it may not be made with the same intentions as the first. I do hope we get a worthy successor someday. But then the series didn't end with Beasts. In 2005 it would return for Walking With Monsters, a look at the Paleozoic. With everything that made the first two great set to return, many were excited for round 3. So why did Monsters not quite have the same sticking power as the first two? The root cause of Monsters being comparatively lacking is fairly obvious, and it's the fact they were only given half the budget for half the episodes. This in turn hamstrung much of what made the rest of the series great. There was no trying to sell a solid narrative in half an hour. It was now trying to squeeze any story full stop into just 10 minutes. It's not that there isn't an effort to try, and the Dimetrodon mother guarding her eggs is nice, just as the Lystrosaurus migration is. But overall the episodes really feel like brief snapshots of the era, rather than the life histories of the animals and what else lives alongside them. Benjamin Bartlett returned, but the soundtrack of Monsters undeniably doesn't match up to Dinosaurs or Beasts. This may be in part due to the much shorter timeframes not fitting Bartlett's methodology. There was no making rich sound worlds for expansive ecosystems, or interesting focal animals this time. It was often just making single pieces of music for individual isolated scenes. I also wonder if Bartlett was just getting tired at this point. In his interview about the music of Dinosaurs, he did say he wanted to move to film. After doing another set of prehistoric music for Beasts, and then the Chased by Dinosaur series as well, he may have ultimately just been burned out with the past, and wanted to move on to new things. On this note, the ending is also a bit weird and overtly fanservice-y too. Euparkeria evolving directly into Allosaurus really ignores all the theropods before Allosaurus. And if they had to do this, why not use Coelophysis to actually bring it full circle, and have Monsters finish where the dinosaurs started, and not the second episode of it? Time of Titans is probably the most well-known piece from the soundtrack, and I'll be damned if it isn't a stirring piece. But again, if they had to do it this way, it could have been used with the Plateosaurus in its first outing rather than the Jurassic. I do like that they wanted to tie the whole trilogy together, but this effort does feel a bit ham-fisted. On the accuracy front too, Monsters is lacking quite a bit. Whilst very visually appealing, the segments of evolution are really not how that worked, to say the very least. There's also some iffy speculation like the venomous Therocephalian, and some stuff that's just flat out wrong. Dimetrodon lived in Everglades-like swamps, about as far an environment as you can get to the barren sun-scorched uplands it was portrayed as living in. For everything that was seemingly learned for Beasts, much was already forgotten by the time of Monsters. Monsters wasn't all bad though, and there are some really solid moments. The segments of the Carboniferous and late Permian especially are overall very nice. And for the latter, the barren landscape does a good job selling the great dying as it happens. The Gorgonopsid that is of course an Ostracevia, why Tim Haynes is allergic to calling them this is beyond me, as there's literally no one else it can be, is also quite cool. And as ever, everything looks great. Despite a lower budget, the effects are still fantastic, both practical and digital. The designs of these animals once again reminds everyone why this trilogy spawns so many paleoart memes replicating it. It does a great job of making them look very appealing and yet very natural too. To be honest, I think Walking with Monsters is overall a very nice documentary of the Paleozoic period with the budget it was given. It's just that following on from such a large legacy, it felt like it came up short in comparison. Had it not been born from the Walking With name, I'd probably look back on it a lot more favourably. Which is again not to say that I didn't enjoy it and still can, which is more than I can say for a few spin-offs.
Walking with Dinosaurs. I wish it was that easy.
A bizarre spin-off of Walking with Dinosaurs was also produced, Chased by Dinosaurs, that later also became Sea Monsters. The story, according to Marvin himself, is that Tim Haynes contacted him and wanted a human presenter to continue on the dinosaur media. And the rest is history. And what a weird decision to make. Walking With already had a winning formula, and to turn it into the Crocodile Hunter doesn't really seem like the logical next step. It's unknown if Beast's lower viewing figures prompted this, or if it was always in the pipeline following the success of Dinosaurs, but overall I feel that Chased by Dinosaurs and Sea Monsters was the death knell for this series. Having a human presenter changes things, and these ripple effects are rife across the episode. We no longer get as much downtime with the dinosaurs, watching them just being animals resting in their spare time. They always have to be doing something to interact with Marvin, be they an enemy, obstacle, or hands-on information dump. As such, we learn less about the overall areas of the Mesozoic the episodes take place in, and less about the dinosaurs themselves too, really. There's no moments like in Giant of the Skies or Death of a Dynasty, where the audience is taught about how plants evolved alongside dinosaurs, or how dinosaurs diverged into birds. Any downtime is spent with Nigel as he goes over his plans for the expedition with the viewer, or how the mission is being hampered by one thing or another. Overall, the educative value just feels a lot lower. The change in this format also affects the soundtrack too, and whilst there's some very nice dramatic tension pieces, like the opening track of Sea Monsters, and its reprise in the deadliest sea of all time, the Liplorodon feeding frenzy is also a great track, with how janky and disorienting it feels in the murky nighttime waters, and an electric guitar is also used for the scene with the Symbospondylus. There's a lot of good spins on different themes of panic or fear or threat, but that's also pretty telling. There's no Islands of Green or Great Journey pieces here. The closest is the Archelon ride, in which Nigel is still openly harassing the wildlife. It's all just action and drama otherwise. And that in turn is another major issue, the depictions of carnivores in these episodes. They just exist to hunt, kill and be aggressive, most crucially to act as dangerous opposition to Nigel. Every single scene with the theropods is either them providing a threat to Nigel, or being engaged in predation, successful or not. They suffer the most from the lack of downtime. There's no moments of them resting or socializing. It's all just violence and threats. The bottom line is, when a human presenter is involved, carnivores turn from just animals into monsters. Chased by Dinosaurs and Sea Monsters sends out the same reductive messages as its copycats, really. I think in 2022 it's worth noting that a human presenter grappling with the wildlife has also aged poorly. In the era of social media where wildlife selfies are finally getting increasingly recognised as either incredibly stupid behaviour around hazardous wild animals, or part and parcel of abusive use of wildlife, we should be enjoying animals as they are, and not without someone yanking on their tail for clicks. And the scripted scenes are idiotic. Nigel literally pulls a Tanistuthius' tail off. He then tries to be killed by a Sarcosuchus. He touches a Therizinosaurus after watching it smack a Tarbosaurus. It's hard to believe he didn't just want to die half the time with his actions around these massive and powerful CGI animals. I should add too, I don't blame Nigel Marvin for any of this. It was Tim Haynes' writing that really made it so bad. Marvin himself clearly had a lot of fun and benefited greatly, going on to do Prehistoric Park and Primeval and get dozens of fans from it. Back when they first came out, when I was a small child, I loved Chased by Dinosaurs as much as the main series. But rewatching it as an adult, I feel it's aged like milk. If there's one bonus, it still looks nice. The visual effects are generally very good, and it's nice to get a few more dinosaurs with that walking with spin on them. The walking with models would get a final hurrah before they vanished forever from independent projects. The BBC made their own quite enjoyable edition of Conan Doyle's The Lost World, which featured a handful of old CGI faces in it. But ultimately, with the completion of Walking with Monsters, this particular chapter of paleomedia came to an end. And it was indeed quite a time to be alive. As a kid, for the whole era, there was no better time to nerd out over dinosaurs. And as said, all the merch and online stuff only nourished that interest. As much as the non-avian dinosaurs themselves, that era is now over, never to be seen again. Despite its flaws, and a lot of people really dislike it for those, which is fair enough, I still think the Walking With series was an overall cause of net good for education, and Dinosaurs I firmly believe is the second most influential piece of paleo media after Jurassic Park itself, as I hope I've shown there is still a lot we can learn from it. And if not, I hope this video at least gave you some food for thought. Thanks for watching. If this is my first video of yours, it's something of an atypical one, as this channel usually deals much more with fictitious animals. But as a creator not enslaved to YouTube for money, I can also make videos on whatever I want. And as you can tell, I really wanted to talk about some of my favourite paleo media. Subscriber or not, I hope if you got this far you enjoyed it and may stick around for more. For my regulars, it's back to Monster Hunter next time, but not for a species analysis. For the next 3 videos I'm going to be discussing broader topics in Monster Hunter overall, so let's see how they go. The next one itself will take quite a bit of time solely to crunch a lot of data, but hopefully the findings will be interesting. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions and showed up for the Q&A as well. 70 plus questions to last over an hour are normally the numbers you see for a YouTube channel 10 times my size. So it's great to see how interested everyone was, and I hope that interest will continue. I'll see you next time.